Okay, so it is time for Ecclesiastes chapter 3. If you've been following along, I hope you've had a wonderful time digging into this old book, which is just so contemporary. It speaks to our world so clearly still today. So we're going to be digging into chapter 3 together. As always, if you are preparing to teach this in some form, I encourage you now to stop and pray. Ask that God would help you to understand His Word, so that you won't be importing your own thoughts into the passage, but rather that you would be trying to understand why God wrote this part of His Word down for us. It's important for us to understand what the original readers would have understood as they read this, and then to try and understand what difference does Jesus make to this passage. So reading this passage through the cross, and then only trying to understand what does it mean for our lives today. So I encourage you to pray first, go and read through this passage a few times, and then I'm going to just highlight, as I always do, just a few things that have stood out for me. As I said, time is the big thing in this passage. You just see time repeated over and over again. Just in these first 8 verses, there are these 14 repetitions of time, all these different seasons and experiences of time in this world. This has been turned into a song by the band in the 60s called The Byrds. It's read at funerals for both Christians and non-Christians. This is a well-loved passage, whether you're a believer or not. And what I want us to see, though, very importantly, is that you cannot just read the first 8 verses, because time is a theme that we'll see in just a couple of other places in this passage. But we actually need verses 9 to 22 if we want to find the real hope and joy that there is in verses 1 to 8. So I'm hoping just to highlight a few things. Again, this is looking at life under the sun, under the heavens. That's what Mr. Teacher has been doing in this book that he's written down for us. In this passage as well, we see that he does mention, yes, there's a time to be born, but there's also a time to die. And he picks up on this theme at the end, kind of this same fate that we've already seen in the book of Ecclesiastes. But he's super bleak in verse 19. As one dies, so dies the other. And here he's talking about animals. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over the animals. That's pretty bleak. Everything is meaningless. This phrase that comes up over and over again in the book of Ecclesiastes. Everything is meaningless. Trying to understand life under the heavens, under the sun, from a merely human perspective, can leave you feeling really bleak. All go to the same place, all come from dust, and to dust all return. So if you just read verse 1 to 8, it's this poetic, beautiful, a time to be born, a time to die, and a time for everything else under the sun. But then in the next few verses, we're kind of hit to the stomach with verse 9. What do workers gain from all their toil? We've seen this same question already in chapter 1, verse 3, and in chapter 2, verse 22. Mr. Teacher's asking, what's the point? But then in these next few chapters, he focuses in on God. And we see a few things about God and the way God has set up the world. going to highlight these. I think it's important to notice repetition like this. And if you've been watching these videos, you'll see that I like color. Color just helps me to spot this repetition very easily. God will bring into judgment. We're going to focus in there just now. Both the righteous and the wicked are going to be judged. God tests them. So a few interesting things that we see about God, and we're going to focus in on that in a moment. This is a theme that we'll see in the book as a whole. God working so that people will fear him. We see right at the end of the book, chapter 12, verse 13, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion to the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. Well, we see that coming in already here in chapter 3. Fear God. Now, there's a whole lot more that could be said about this chapter. We've got these themes that we saw, the carpe diem passages. There's nothing better. Said there's nothing better here again than for people to be happy and to do good while they live, to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil. This is the gift of God. So again, these kind of seize the day, make the most of the opportunity that you have here under the sun. But I want to just highlight what I think is vitally important for us to see in this chapter. So I'm going to just focus in on verse 11 and verse 17. Where time is mentioned again, because all of this focus on time in verse 1 to 8, time comes up here again in verse 11. God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. So we get this idea in verse 11 that God is in control, but no one can fathom. We can't get our minds around exactly what God is doing from beginning to end. And that's okay. That is just a realization that God is God and we are not. He set eternity in the human heart, meaning he's given us a sense that there is a bigger picture, but as we live here under the sun, we can't always get it. But Mr. Teacher is wanting us to realize that God has made everything beautiful in its time. Because God is in control, everything will work out according to his plan. Verse 14, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it or nothing taken from it. The way God has set up the world will reach the end to which God has planned. He will make everything beautiful in its time. Trust him. See, God does it so that people will fear him. That's what Mr. Teacher wants us, where he wants us to end up. To fear God is holding God in such a high regard that you trust him absolutely, and you display this trust by obeying him wholeheartedly. So I think it's really important to just see this use of time. Yes, the ebb and flow of our lives here, a time to live, a time to be born, a time to die, and a time for everything in between. Stepping back from that, we need to realize that God's in control of time, and he will make all things beautiful in time. I think the next reality check about time is in many ways the most important. Verse 17, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked. For there will be a time for every activity, and then a time to judge every deed. The reality of judgment is brought up in this passage. And actually that's a good thing, because Mr. Teacher's looking and he's saying there's wickedness, even in the place where there should be justice. There's wickedness there. Our world is in a mess, but there is a time coming when all will be judged. And that's a good thing. We should be thankful to God that a time is coming when he will judge the mess that we see in the world around us. But we've also got to realize that a time is coming when our actions will be judged. Now, I think at this point, it's worth jumping ahead and just realizing that God has mapped out all things from before eternity past till eternity, for all eternity to come. And in Galatians 4, we read that at just the right time, God sent his Son to come and live under the sun in order to redeem us so that we might be his children. And we need to remember that time when Jesus came to save us from our sins, to save us from all the mess that we make with our time. And there is a time when that same Jesus is coming again to judge. And because we know that is going to happen, this reality fundamentally affects the way we use our time. We want to use our time in a way that will help others to realize that they need to fear God, that they need to turn to him. We need to use our time in a way that will bring glory to this God who loves us and who has time in his hands. And as Paul says in Ephesians 5, we need to redeem our time, to make the most of our time, because these days are wicked, making the best use of our time. So as you dig in and see these themes about time, it's important to just remember these first 8 verses by themselves could have been written by an atheist. So don't just focus in on them. We need the reality check of verses 9 to 22 to really understand how to make the most of the time we've been given. We need to know that God's in control. We need to know that judgment is coming. And those reality checks must affect the way we use our time. So as you dig in, I trust that you'll find the richness that is here in this passage, and that it would encourage you, that it would stir you to use your time well, and then that you'd go and teach this to others. There's so many around us who are not ready for eternity. They don't yet realize that Jesus is coming to judge. They need to hear this. So let's use our time to make that known. Well, God bless as you dig into this passage.